Kia ora and welcome to episode 5 of Forest Call. And today we make a call on climate change, what trees can do about resisting it, how that works, pines versus indigenous rates of carbon sequestration, and how farmers' use of mapping technology might show them the best places to plant trees. But first, I've got something to show you. This is a cubic metre of timber, 1 by 1 by 1. Thanks to J&L for setting this up to indicate the standard measurement of New Zealand's plantation forest industry. Every 10 days or so throughout the year, the equivalent of 1 million of these are extracted out of our forests, mostly for export, but not all of it. They leave behind in a dynamic equilibrium of planting, harvesting and replanting about 500 million tonnes of wood in our forests, decade in and decade out. The other reason I'm standing in front of a pile of wood is to talk about the Forest Growers Levy. It's a levy that's paid on the first point of sale of a log after it's harvested. The current rate is 27 cents per cubic metres, or if you use the other currency of coins out of circulation, it's represented by that, 27 cents per cubic metre. That levy is invested mostly in forest research, but also in things like biosecurity, health and safety, fire awareness, industry promotion and transport. That levy vote comes up next year for renewal. So in subsequent episodes of Forest Call, we're going to be talking to informed farm foresters about that levy and why there should be a positive vote for it in March and April in 2019. Now, the other big reveal on this block of timber is what it's made from, carbon. Carbon makes up all life forms, ourselves included. And that means in our forests we have about 125 million tonnes of carbon locked up in those trees, as well as the wood that is extracted from those trees, which may last hundreds of years, longer than the life of the tree themselves. It means that it's locked up in the wood. It's not free carbon, it's not atmospheric carbon, and it's not carbon dioxide, which is the major greenhouse gas causing climate change and global warming. And that is what this episode of Forest Call is all about. Newsflash. The Productivity Commission's reported to government that we need to plant up to 2.8 million extra hectares of forests to counter industry and agriculture greenhouse gas emissions, and so to achieve carbon neutrality for New Zealand by the year 2050. We have as our guest on Forest Call today the chair of the Productivity Commission, Murray Sherwin, who's just issued his report. Murray, thank you for joining us on Forest Call. Now, up to 2.8 million hectares of new planting, and the usual reaction when I talk to somebody in the forest industry is to put their lips together and blow air through it. This is huge. It's unbelievably huge as a recommendation.
You're absolutely, well, it's not a recommendation. It's a product that comes out of the modelling that says if we're going to go from where we are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions as a nation to net zero by 2050, which is the government's target, what do we have to do and what are the most efficient paths through it? So it's not a recommendation, it comes out of the modelling and says, well, you've got to do a whole bunch of things. You've got to stop burning fossil fuels, and then there's a whole bunch of land use changes which come about as well. And afforestation is a really important sort of swing factor in all of this, because that's the one that takes up the load when you can't reduce the carbon emissions in industry and transport and elsewhere. But yeah, so it's a very big number.
Accounts for the difference between 1.5 and 2.8. It's how much success you've got elsewhere will reduce that.
Yeah, so we ran the modelling, or we employed others to run the modelling, which goes through a range of different assumptions, largely about how much technology help you get, because technology, new technology is the nearest thing we've got to a silver bullet here. You need solar power that comes on cheaply and quickly. You need a whole bunch of things in electric vehicles or other forms of low emission vehicles, low emission heat for industry, all of those sorts of things. If you don't get the big gains in technology, then you need a carbon sink somewhere to help you to get to 2050. And it's the different scenarios that give you that range between the 1.3 and the 2.8 million hectares of new forestry over that period.
That really means that the government is going to drive this land use change. it's not a commercial outcome as a result, for instance, that we saw dairying expand?
Well, it's commercial in the sense that it will largely be driven by price, and the price is the carbon price. So the government sets its target, it's got an ETS presumably, and the ETS comes with a price, and that price will continue to increase if we're going to get to our targets. And what the modelling does is gives an indication of the sort of price you're likely to need under different scenarios and different assumptions to get to net zero. And that price goes from, we're currently $24, $25 a tonne. We're probably going to have to get quite quickly to closer to 50, 75, and by the time you get to 2050, the price sort of slides on up. And it slides on up as you remove free allocations to industry and agriculture, and as you start climbing up the marginal abatement cost curve, if you like. You're getting into more and more complicated abatement options, assuming that depending on what the technology does. So the price goes up, and on the modelling, it ends up at somewhere between, $150 and sort of $250 a tonne, which is inside the range of other developed countries. So it's not well inside the range, actually. So it's not completely off the wall. I don't think we'll need to get that high, because we've had a huge amount of engagement with industry and people in the business over the course of this inquiry, and I've actually been quite impressed with how much quite deep thinking is going on and how many options are beginning to emerge for companies that do have an emissions problem and are thinking pretty hard about what they're going to do about it.
Where would this commercial forestry, part of the option, be installed? Where would it be planted?
It'll go where it's most efficient at the price that carbon units are suggesting, are giving it, the signals that are coming out of the carbon price. Again, using the MOTU land use modelling, which is quite granular in how it depicts land use changes. We see a lot on the east coast, Gisborne area, and it's largely into areas which are marginal sheep and beef, and there's also a distinction between what's intended to be commercial forestry for harvest, which of course is shaped by access and distance and all the rest of it, and the potential for sort of permanent forest sinks, which may be indigenous and may be further away, more remote, more difficult to harvest, maybe not intended to be harvested, in fact. But Gisborne, Lower North Island, Manawatu, Wanganui, Wairarapa, and then down to Canterbury, Otago, those sorts of areas you would expect to be picking up most of this.
If we could just go back to that point of permanent forest and indigenous forests. I mean, this is a report that the previous Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright, produced a couple of years ago, which showed clearly the carbon sequestration ability of pine trees was far in excess, at least for the first 50-odd years, to that of regenerating podocarps, which is the comparison she made. Surely then, if we want to minimise our social disruption of transforming a lot of current farmland into forests, we need to maximise the heavy lifters, the pine trees, in comparison to indigenous tree species.
Yeah, I think it's a more subtle equation than that, because you might put your permanent forestry land, the indigenous forestry, in land which is quite remote, relatively low productivity, and that might be a perfectly sensible thing to do. And the production Pinus radiata, presumably, in the land which is a bit closer, a bit more likely to be harvested. So, you'll have a mix, I think, of both, and quite where that balance falls out depends on the price and expectations of future price, and where the investors think they can best optimise their returns. Where it goes is dependent basically on the relative returns of agriculture, mostly marginal sheep and beef, versus forestry with carbon prices in it, and that will determine what goes where.
Isn't there another factor, though? I mean, you're displacing, if this suggestion was adopted, a lot of pastoral agriculture and replacing it with trees. Surely there is also an imperative to do everything that is possible to maximise the returns of those trees when they're harvested, to basically pay for that displacement of pastoral agriculture over the previous 25 years or so.
Well, again, some of this will be paid for by the carbon price, and not harvested. So
for that which is harvested.
For that which is harvested, well, it'll go where the relative returns on the harvest returns plus the carbon returns versus what they could get on the same land as sheep and beef or whatever the other marginal activity is, that's where it'll go. And it's kind of hard to determine that. It'll fall out of entrepreneurs making their choices, placing their cash where they think they can do best.
How long can trees be used for carbon sequestration if we're talking about a time scale that goes through to the end of the century?
Well, the Pinus radiata, you're looking at 30 odd years. I think it probably continues to 40 odd. I'm not quite sure what the scientists say exactly. The indigenous trees might go on for 100 years or more and ultimately sequester more, but it's slower. This is focused on the immediate target, which is 2050. And the afforestation, which is coming out of the modelling, is critical to getting there. But we also say very clearly that this is only a temporary solution. It buys us some time because you can't keep on adding, more millions of hectares of trees in New Zealand. You're going to be needing to make real progress on gross emissions out of transport and industry and elsewhere.
Finally, Murray, the recent listener, excellent article by a former colleague of mine, Veronica Maduna, 10 pages, but talking about farmers mitigating their greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions. Hardly a mention, though, of forestry. Somebody's got a big selling act to do, haven't they?
Yeah, look, I think there's plenty of awareness out there, and it's been around really since ETS. Although perhaps as the ETS prices collapsed, the interest fell away. But I think there'll be a huge amount of interest in forestry and where it takes us. The big challenge for foresters is that foresters love growing trees, but we really have to get a lot smarter about thinking about what to do with them at the end of that. And that's where I think forestry really has its biggest challenges, actually.
Murray, thank you for joining us on Forest Call.
My pleasure.
Now, let's go and fill an information gap of how all of this physically actually works. What's the broad principle of how we get carbon into trees, out again, and back again? Let's look at this very simple carbon cycle, nothing to do with other greenhouse gases, just carbon. That cycle has been going on since life began. Here's where most carbon is. It's locked up in usually solid things, in carbon chains, that wooden block we saw at the beginning, for instance, coal, diamonds, oil too. Carbon in this form doesn't cause climate change. But then, as a part of a now accelerated natural process, carbon breaks out as carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere. Natural process again, photosynthesis extracts carbon from carbon dioxide and locks it back into organic structures. Now, here's the Earth in the present climate change mode. Sun's beating down like it always has, but there's a thickening one-way blanket. The sun's rays go down through that carbon dioxide blanket okay, but now bounce back against the blanket. The heat stays trapped at the surface. There's also the carbon building in the oceans from extra carbon dioxide as carbonic acid, making the oceans more acidic. So back to the carbon cycle. More of this from mostly industry burning fuel is not at all good for the planet. And more of this, which is what trees and other plants do, is good to prevent global warming. Let's go now to talk to someone who's qualified to tell us what the Productivity Commission proposal actually means. Ewan Mason, the Productivity Commission has now come out with its final recommendations, a massive increase in the planting area. Could you compare it with what we already know, already on a large scale, the Billion Trees program? What's the difference?
Yes, well, the Billion Trees program is for a billion trees. It doesn't specify an area. But roughly half of the billion trees would have been planted anyway because it's replanting of existing areas that have been harvested or are to be harvested over the next 10 years. So we're looking at, say, 500 million new trees to be planted in new areas of forest. And if we assume about 1,000 trees per hectare, we're probably talking about 500,000 hectares of new forests through the Billion Tree program. Compare that with the Productivity Commission's recommendations, which are for somewhere between 1.3 and about 2.7 or 2.8 million hectares of new forest required. There's quite a big difference.
And the timescale also?
Yes, the timescale is different. We have 10 years for the Billion Tree program and I think 30 years for the Productivity Commission.
Well, let's now look at the reasons for the billion trees, which had an economic, a productivity, a regional development, as well as an environmental one. The Productivity Commission, the reason for this report and recommendation is carbon sequestration.
Exactly, yes. So it's just one objective, and once you know your objectives, it's much easier to identify the species required and the area where you're going to plant the trees. If you're talking about regional development as well, that's reasonably compatible with the billion trees, with the Productivity Commission objectives of carbon sequestration. If we were to plant and leave radiata pine, for instance, it would sequester far more, though, than if we wanted to harvest, which of course may be one of the objectives of regional development. So there is that difference.
Well, let's, in the first instance, look at the carbon sequestration capacity of pine trees compared with what is obviously a range of species of indigenous trees.
Yes. Well, as a rough guide, over its life, a radiata pine plantation might sequester 30 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. Now, it does vary depending on where the trees are planted and how they're managed, and the rate can be considerably higher, and in some cases lower than that. The numbers for exotic species are probably a little better known than those for native forest plantations. We haven't tended to plant many plantations of native species, and clearly need to do some research on how fast how much we can push them to try and sequester more. But I would imagine we'd be struggling to get much beyond 10 from most of our native species.
Though the time scale again is an important factor, because if you wait for regenerating podocarps or kauri or whatever to grow for long enough, but we are not going to meet that 2050 target if we
Exactly right, yes. If we want to meet the 2050 target, we would need a much, much larger area of native forest than of radiata pine forest, for instance, in order to meet the same target.
How expensive is it then to grow forests of native trees?
Well, at the moment,
the suggestion is that pigeons will spread the seeds and you leave it alone.
In some cases, if we can regenerate forests like that, we may be able to make it relatively inexpensive. But of course, the development of a forest that's regenerated in that way is very, very slow. So it takes a long time before it reaches any reasonable sequestration rate. If we were to plant native forests directly with native forest seedlings, well, currently they're very, very expensive. So we're talking many thousands of dollars per hectare. I'm encouraged, though, that the Manuka industry, the Manuka honey industry, has resulted in a lowering of the cost of Manuka seedlings. They would have been quite a few dollars per tree just a few years ago, and we're now down to about 75 cents a tree. So there may be economies of scale, but these things are still to be worked out. There are still some difficulties in the nursery with pricing and with actually achieving the numbers of trees that we're talking about if they're native
And
trees.
what about after the planting? What sort of protection do indigenous species require?
Well, there again depends on what people are prepared to do. In plantations, we often use, for instance, spot control of weeds to increase the growth rate initially, and that spot control is required for just a short time because the species grows so rapidly. With native species, if we were to apply herbicide to increase the rate of growth, they still wouldn't grow as rapidly as our exotic species, and therefore we'd have to have a longer period of herbicidal control. So that would be more expensive.
What is the viability of waiting for pines to mature and letting the indigenous species regenerate and grow underneath them?
Native forest often comes up under plantations, particularly on warm, wet sites. And if you have local seed sources, if you plant exotic species, you'll eventually get a native forest. And the usual cycle of harvesting of a plantation, both the plantation and the emerging native species are usually flattened during the harvesting operation, and the whole system starts again. If we were to leave the exotic forest without harvesting and allow it to continue to sequester, then our best guesses are that it would eventually regenerate into native forests. And once the exotic species grew old and died, the native forest would come through and take over.
And Ewan Mason is sceptical of how the emissions trading scheme actually works. It's too complicated for television, but essentially he says, as presently constructed, it's irrational in its outcome and effects. Coming up, I'll be talking to a fertiliser company representative who was talking technology to a group of farmers, which started them talking about where it made sense to to replace pasture with trees. Our planted forest industry, challenging to be our second primary export earner. Woods, environmentally good in plant and product for building and landscapes. We're great in technology and science, selecting stronger, straighter trees, safer ways to harvest them, cleaner and earthquake-resistant ways to build. Forests, regionally vital for economic development, creating all sorts of jobs. A prime future investment for our nation. Love our forests. Mike, this is something of an involved story, but let's start at the beginning. You were having a discussion with a farmer group in Wairarapa. Now, why is this relevant to forestry?
So we called a group of prominent farmers in the Wairarapa together, and the purpose we did that was to involve them early in some emerging technology we were working on. And that technology goes under the name of hyperspectral scanning. Fancy word for a camera that we put in an aircraft that we fly over the farm and can tell us a lot of information quickly about the farm. And so the farmers were naturally interested in the technology, but the conversation moved on from there. They said, that's really good. So with this technology, they said, we can be a lot more discerning about the different land classes on our farm, what might be the opportunities with that knowledge. For example, some of it may be a candidate for a little more fertiliser to grow a little more pasture, some of it sensibly a little less fertiliser, and maybe there's an alternative land use for this country, often because of moisture constraints, doesn't produce much pasture. That could be in trees, woodlots, or other things. And there may be other areas that we can consider other types of land uses. It might be pip fruit, horticulture, citrus, or whatever. So that seeded the conversation, really.
So really what they were saying was that whatever your intrinsic sort of feel about forestry might be, that if you put some objective measurements down, forestry makes sense in some parts.
They were very open to that. They were saying it makes sense. The first thing was, they said, look, probably one size fits all, a blanket land use is probably inappropriate, given the opportunity or the variability in hill country. So a blanket land use, they said, intuitively doesn't feel so well. Your technology gives us a lot more information to be a bit more discerning and make some decisions. So they said, clearly there's areas that well suited to production forestry, other areas pasture, other areas alternatives. Having your information allows us to progress that more quickly. So
how important would this, Mike, be for farmers who want to diversify their risk?
I think it's a good opportunity. Let's have a think about what's coming down the road at us. Greenhouse gases will be more part of our future than less. And so things like sequestering carbon, be it in the soil or be it in lignin in forestry, is an important consideration. So the second thing is, if you've got multiple income streams rather than just one income stream, particularly where the one income stream happens over 2 months, and you've got multiple income streams, to spread your risk, spread your income, is got to be of more benefit than just a single land use. So both of those combined were important. The third thing they're thinking about is, there are understandably rules around the amount of nitrate one can leach. That's directly correlated to the number of type of animals. So if you have a farming enterprise where you perhaps have less animals, but those ones that you do have higher producing on better pastures, your total footprint may be lower, which is important to a lot of people going forward in terms of leaching by having a multiple land use. So greenhouse gases, income, risk, nitrate leaching were all seeding the discussion about a more sensible approach to a farming environment rather than one type of enterprise.
Well, I actually went to university to do engineering, and it wasn't until day one that I met some guys that were doing forestry, and it really appealed to me, so I made the change. And yeah, this is how I've ended up here. The course is a very broad course, studying things from economics and science right through to practical forestry skills. You study for 4 years and it gives you a Bachelor of Forestry Science, and if you choose to, you can also do a honours as well. It's a very good mixture. As you get into the degree, you can start refining what you do and choosing different papers depending on what your preferences are. The School of Forestry has some really supportive staff, and if there's ever any issues with some of the courses or questions, they're right there to help you through it. The forestry school prepared us very well to go into the professional world, for the fact that it's a small class and they get to spend a lot of time on you to develop you as a person and as a member of a professional company. So basically the transition was pretty straightforward, and along with a bit of professional development from my company that I work for now, I'm in pretty good stead. There was 21 people graduated from my class, and I think everybody got a job, and there was still 3 or 4 jobs which they couldn't fill because there just wasn't enough graduates to fill the roles. My career path could be anything at the moment. It's basically world's my oyster. There's plenty of different pathways within the industry that I could go down, and at the moment I'm just working hard and continuing to try and develop myself and see where it takes me. The forestry industry has lots of different options with jobs from outdoors to indoors, but also it's only a half an hour to an hour drive to most forestry blocks, and so it's not as if you're going to be isolated or taken away from society. Obviously forestry is a long-term investment. Any planting of forest now won't be harvested until 25 to 30 years time. So out of the basis of that, there's going to be forestry in New Zealand for a long time. There's going to be more planting of forestry due to environmental reasons, and I think that there'll be plenty of work going forward. You can just tell from when you go into the forest, the fresh air that it's just produced, you can tell that it's doing wonders for the environment. It's a pretty guilt-free industry in the way that, yeah, you can sleep well at night.
Why should there be a positive vote by small-scale farm foresters, woodlot owners?
The levy has benefited all foresters, but in particular it has benefited small-scale forest growers, because 90% of the research done has been of benefit to all forest growers, and there's been particular projects that has worked on small-scale forest projects to improve the profitability of those, and it has provided a steady stream of income for all sorts of promotion of forestry and important issues like safety and things infecting the environment, so that our reputation as foresters is maintained.
.7 million hectares of our planted forests, trees locking up millions of tonnes of climate change surplus carbon from the atmosphere, then storing it in our buildings. Standing forests binding the landscape, cleaning waterways and absorbing floodwaters. A sheltering habitat for our endangered birds. Forests as places to ride your bike, go for a run. Treescapes for a fun time, sweat or relaxation among the trees. Love our forests. That's Forest Call for this week. Just enough time to look forward to see what's coming up next week. Ka kite. On Forest Call next week, from wiping out most of our native forests a century and more ago to again seriously looking at the potential for indigenous tree species to become sustainable production forests.